Rampage, a movie where a giant mutated gorilla fights other giant monsters. And that's just Dwayne Johnson. Dwayne Johnson is a primatologist who discovers that his best friend George, the albino gorilla, has been mutated by a secret research project involving genetic editing. George is growing bigger, faster, stronger, and more aggressive. Ralph, a giant wolf, and someone who my research tells me is Lizzie, a giant crocodile type thing, are also out and about destroying things and fucking up Chicago. When The Rock joins forces with a geneticist who worked on the project and a secret agent who wants to stop the carnage, it's up to them to track down George and his animal buddies and put a halt to this rampage. I feel like Dwayne The Rock Johnson, whose character name in this I've completely forgotten, has kind of got his own genre now, in a way that Arnold Schwarzenegger or Steven Seagal kind of created their own niches and then occupied them. I think Dwayne Johnson has this niche that's like a mix of this big CGI action, this sort of particular character type that he always plays, and it just really works for me. I can't say it's good, because it isn't, but it does work for me. And it obviously works for a mass audience too. You only have to look at Jumanji, which was just a box office juggernaut that started in December and played all the way through until like March. I mean, they were playing it really recently at my local cinema. And that's crazy. That's a run in a cinema that you almost never get nowadays. And yet Dwayne Johnson managed it with Jumanji. And I think it is him. I think the value for him as having his own sort of like film brand is that the audience knows what they're going to get. And when I saw the trailer for this film, where there was this huge, beefy Dwayne The Rock Johnson saying, "That's my best friend," and he's talking about a giant gorilla, I was like, yeah, I will watch that. The question is whether or not I regret that decision, and that is a more interesting debate to have. After an opening sequence where a scientist is like chased through a space station by a giant mutated rat, we cut to The Rock doing his thing on Earth, being The Rock, playing around with giant gorillas and making fun of weaker guys, but also turning down ladies because he's a responsible, family-oriented dude. Alright, he's a family dude who's all about respect and life and love and learning along the way. There's nothing clever about these scenes. There are characters who show up and seem like they're going to be somebody, and it turns out they're just exposition fairies, right? They've arrived just to explain something to the audience via talking to someone else. It's really transparent when it's a character talking to another character about that character and just talking about what they're like as a person. So there's a scene when PJ Byrne talks to The Rock when The Rock's like leaving work, getting in his car, he's just turned down a pretty girl for a date, and the guy goes, "Look dude, like why isn't it you don't like humans and you like animals?" And The Rock says, "Animals get me." And then he drives away, and PJ Byrne just says to himself, "Girls love him." Like, there's no narrative function to any of that. It just serves to explain to the audience who that guy is and what's going on. I'm in a bit of a hard place with this, really, because I've seen so many blockbusters where they don't do that at all, and then you literally know nothing about the main characters. And to be honest, I prefer them telling you in a really bad way than not knowing anything at all. Like, it can be better than this. Like, you can explain that just with what was happening in the film anyway. I mean, most of Rampage is so one note that it is explained just by the action that takes place in it. You don't need these sequences where people just explain what they're doing to each other. And when we meet the villains, they are similarly two-dimensional. One thing that I really liked about Jumanji was that there wasn't really like a villain. There's a character who is like a villain, but he's barely in the film, and he's just sort of part of the game. And I liked that. It meant that the film had its own sort of vibe to it. Here, for some reason, we have villains who are corrupt corporate executives, or I should say they are very bad actors playing a pantomime version of what corrupt corporate executives are. I didn't recognise either of these characters. I actually wrote in my notebook, nobody's doing pantomime evil exec stuff. But of course one of them is actually Malin Ackerman, who has been in quite a few films. She was in Watchmen, the Zack Snyder film. I don't know why people keep casting her. I think she's a terrible actor. You know, she's bad in Watchmen, but she is appalling here. Like, she really has nothing to work with and doesn't really give anything to the part. It's just upsetting almost to watch her scenes. And what I can really respect about the film is that it recognises there's only one thing you want to see, which is giant monsters smashing stuff up and Dwayne Johnson running around with them and calling a giant gorilla his best friend. And it goes straight to that. You know, another movie would have half an hour, 40 minutes of like build up to that. But nope, you got a giant gorilla smashing stuff up 20 minutes in. Perfect. That's all you need, really. And the film continues at that breakneck speed until you get to the good stuff where the giant monsters are fighting each other in the city. And because we're continuing at this breakneck speed, no one ever really gets any development, and we don't really move beyond this extremely shallow surface layer of like exposition speak to each other, where we're just explaining what's going on to people who've already experienced it or are currently experiencing it. So there's a sequence where the giant gorilla smashes his way out of like a transit plane that The Rock and Naomi Harris are on, and then they fall out of the plane and the plane crashes, but the gorilla survives. Which you know as an audience because you've seen the trailer where the gorilla's in a city and he's not got to the city yet, so you know he's going to live. And it immediately then cuts to a scene of the corrupt corporate executives hanging out with each other, and the guy says to Malin Ackerman, "Did you see the satellite footage? The gorilla survived the crash." So you're just explaining stuff to the audience over and over again, making it really, really clear, and I don't really understand the value in that, because it's not like it's a brief sequence that you might have missed that part out in. They make quite a big noise about the fact that the gorilla was in the crash and then survived the crash when The Rock's there with Naomi Harris. I think in mainstream releases you can have problems like that. Like, I remember when Dark Knight Rises came out, there was lots of people saying, how is it possible that Bruce Wayne recovered from his spinal injury within like a week? And if you pay attention in those sequences, you realise that there's quite a lot of signifiers that it's taking about 3 months. But it's not that clear, really. And in a film that's that big and that loud and that long, I kind of understand why audiences didn't pick up on it. In a case like this, where it's like one scene to one scene, guys, just pay attention. Like, it's really obvious. We don't need that in the film, so don't put it in there. And almost all of the dialogue in the film runs on a similar sort of basis. So it's just exposition speak and very, very shallow aphorisms. That's about as deep as the characters get with each other. Everything in it is just a very quick transactional explanation of what the characters are doing and where they're going next. Like I said, I appreciate that they explain it, because a lot of movies just don't even explain anything at all. But like, after a while, it feels like you're a child being told what to make of the film as it carries on. Jeffrey Dean Morgan is having a lot of fun. I mean, obviously, The Rock is just doing his own thing, and everyone knows what that is, and he does it here, so no surprises there. But Jeffrey Dean Morgan is just chewing the scenery in every scene that he's in. He's this, like, swaggering cowboy secret agent who's in charge of, like, a scientific agency where they stop, like, crimes of science. And he'll say stuff like, "As my grandpappy always says, assholes have to stick together." Or when he's explaining his role at his agency, "When science shits the bed, I'm the one who cleans up the sheets." You know, kudos to him. I think he's the closest thing the movie has to something non-committee based. It's sort of really odd and just a strange performance choice that just sticks out in the middle of the film and is quite enjoyable for that. The last 30 or 40 minutes of the film is really what all of the marketing is focused around and what you're there for, which is watching Dwayne Johnson be dwarfed by these giant beasts that are attacking each other, and that's very fun. They do some interesting sequences there. I don't really want to spoil it for anyone who's in there just for the thrill ride, but they do go slightly above and beyond the normal action set-piecey stuff, and they do some interesting sort of like staging, little bits of choreography that are quite good fun. This movie is not high art, and it was never going to be. It's also not interesting beyond itself. So whereas Jumanji has kind of grown on me, and I think really spoke to the audience that came to it, I don't know if this film will. I think it's a pretty solid 3-star movie, but it is super forgettable. Yeah, that draws a pretty good line underneath it. Rampage, not really notably anything. One more little thing that I noticed and thought was really funny, and not because the filmmakers wanted it to be. There was obviously this discussion where they were like, how are we going to work in like little Easter eggs from the video game that this is adapted from? Which, you know, has no depth in it whatsoever, so I have no idea why they would even try to do that. But in the corporate executive scenes, when they're in their office and they're like talking about this drug they've made, the Rampage drug or whatever that makes the monsters mutate, in the background of that scene there's just like an arcade game of Rampage in their office. They're not like secret video game nerds who've been inspired by the video game or whatever. They've just got the game in the back, just slightly out of focus. And that's obviously supposed to be like an Easter egg, but it's so badly done and sort of like unsubtle that it just doesn't really fulfill that. And that just gave me a thrill. I kind of like that generic attempt at making something have an interesting call out, especially after seeing Ready Player One, a movie that sort of lived and died on its Easter egg content. It was just hysterical that they tried to justify it like that. But anyway, that's it from me. If you've seen Rampage, let me know what you thought in the comments down below. I especially love to hear from my fellow Dwayne The Rock Johnson fans. And if you haven't seen it, but you don't want to or whatever, then let me know about that as well, because I'm interested to see people who don't like watching shit films, because I do like watching shit films. That's it from me. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.